Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the fourth lecture in literary criticism. My name is Dr. Fawzi Slisley, and I will be doing this fourth lecture. This week we are looking at the second and last lecture on ancient Greece. Last week we talked about Plato's contribution to literary criticism. Today we're going to talk about the contribution of another giant thinker, Aristotle, and we will look at his contribution, his analysis of tragedy. So, Bismillah. First, a general observation. Plato versus Aristotle. Unlike Plato, Aristotle has always been very easy to incorporate into Western literature and Western criticism, into Western literary and philosophical systems. Plato was too complicated. He bans poetry. He's concerned about how poetry connects to education, to politics, and so on. Aristotle is easy. He's not as complicated as that. So Aristotle has proved easy to assimilate within Western systems of thought, Western criticism, Western literature, much more than Plato. Aristotle's analysis of tragedy in the Poetics is still today the foundation of artistic, dramatic, and literary practice, meaning his ideas on, mostly it's his critique of tragedy. The ideas that Aristotle developed in that critique of tragedy remain today the foundation of artistic, dramatic, and literary practice. And also, a lot of Western scholars who dislike Plato's discussion of poetry or disagree with him, they are usually full of praise for Aristotle. They like Aristotle because he's too easy to assimilate. For example, John Jones in 1962, he says, when Aristotle comes to challenge his great master and speaks up for art, meaning he comes to the defense of art, because they feel that Plato was disrespectful to art. So he says, when Aristotle comes to challenge his master and speaks up for art, his attitude to the work of imitation is altogether more respectful. They find Aristotle more respectful about art. 1991, Wolfgang Iser says the same thing. He says, one must keep in mind Plato's devaluation of mimesis, meaning of art, Plato's devaluation of mimesis, in order to appreciate the impact of the repairs Aristotle undertook. So Wolfgang Iser thinks that Aristotle repaired what Plato had broken, right? 1986, Theodor Adorno, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, says the same thing. He says, Plato is known to have had shifting opinions on art. That means Plato had different shifting opinions on art, depending on whether he thought art was useful or detrimental for his ideal state. Aristotle's was also an aesthetic of effect, but a more enlightened and dehumanized one. So Theodor Adorno finds Aristotle's analysis of poetry and art and literature to be more enlightened. For this reason, Aristotle, for centuries, practically from the 16th century to the present, Aristotle has been, in the words of Gerald Else, the czar of literary criticism. Aristotle has been almost like the king, the czar of literary criticism. And his book, The Poetics, has almost been like the Bible of literary criticism. And I'm using the words of Gerald Else, who uses the word Tsar and Bible. The Poetics has functioned very much like a Bible of literary criticism. There were times when a critic or an artist or a writer would not be taken seriously, would not even be respected if he doesn't respect the laws of Aristotle's especially in the poetics. So this lecture will illustrate some of the main concepts of the poetics, Aristotle's poetics. In the poetics, Aristotle gives us a definition of tragedy, and this definition will have a huge impact from the 16th century to the present. He says, tragedy then is an imitation of an action. It's an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narration, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. Every tragedy, therefore, must have 6 parts, which parts determine its quality, namely plot, characters, diction, thought, spectacle, and melody. So these are the 6 parts of tragedy. And he says basically that tragedy is an imitation of an action, that it inspires, that it's presented in the form of action, not of narration. Remember the distinction we made with Plato, the distinction between showing and telling, imitation and narration, mimesis and diegesis. So Aristotle is telling us that tragedy is an imitation of an action, that it is presented in the form of action, not of narration, that it arouses pity and fear, and it accomplishes a catharsis, that it has 6 parts: plot, characters, diction, thought, spectacle, and melody. So let's look a little bit closer at some of these definitions. Tragedy is an imitation of an action. It's the mimesis of an action, according to the law of probability or necessity, according to the laws of probability or necessity. Aristotle says that tragedy is an imitation of action, not a narration. Tragedy shows you an action, it doesn't tell you about it, right? So tragedy arouses pity and fear, right? It arouses pity and fear because the audience simply can see themselves within the cause-effect chains of the action. We identify with the hero, we feel the pain of the hero, we feel the happiness of the hero, so it creates pity and fear in us. We fear that something bad will happen to the hero, and we are happy. We fear pity if something, happens bad to the hero, and we rejoice and are happy with the hero. So this is what he means. The first principle of tragedy is the plot. The plot. Aristotle defines the plot as the arrangement of the incidents. He's not talking about the story. A lot of people think the plot is the story. So the plot of a film is the story of the film. That's not what Aristotle is talking about. He's talking about the way the incidents are presented to the audience. He's talking about the structure of the play. Plot is the order and the arrangement of these incidents in a cause-effect sequence of events, right? Cause-effect, right? And the way those cause-effects trigger each other, from this cause to this effect, from this cause to... This is what he means by plot. It's the structural engineering of that cause-effect sequence that makes up the play. That's what he means by the plot. According to Aristotle, tragedies where the outcome depends on a tightly constructed cause and effect chain of events are superior, right, to those that depend primarily on the character and personality of the hero or protagonist. So basically, the plays that have a tight cause-effect sequence are better than tragedies or plays that just depend on the personality of a character or a hero or protagonist. Aristotle gives us the good qualities for a good plot. A good plot has some qualities. It should be whole. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning, it should be whole and complete, and it should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning, called by modern critics the incentive moment, it's the sequence that starts the cause and effect chain, right? The beginning of a play, or the beginning of a film, or the beginning of a story, that's where the cause-effect chain of events should begin, right? The middle of the plot, usually called the climax, must be caused by earlier incidents, and itself causes the incidents that come after it. So it's in the middle, it's called the climax. The end or the resolution of a play or tragedy or a film must be caused by the preceding events, but it shouldn't lead to any more events. That's it, it's the end. The end should therefore solve or resolve the problems created during the beginning, the incentive moments. Those problems created in the beginning should find a resolution in the end of the play. Aristotle calls the cause and effect chain leading from the incentive moment to the climax, from the incentive moment, the beginning, to the climax, the middle, he calls this the tying up. The tying up. To tie up, like in when you say tie up your shoes, right? So he calls it the tying up. The Greek word is desis. In modern terminology, it's simply called the complications. This is from the beginning to the middle, the climax. From the climax to the resolution, the cause-effect sequence of events, from the beginning to the resolution to the end, Aristotle calls it the unraveling. The unraveling. Modern critics today use the French word dénouement. It's the dénouement, le dénouement. So he tells us that the plot must be complete and should have unity of action. By this, Aristotle means that the plot must be structurally self-contained. Structurally self-contained. It means that the incidents should be bound together by an internal necessity. Internal necessity. There is no accidents, there's an internal necessity. Each action leading inevitably to the next with no outside intervention. According to Aristotle, the worst kinds of plot are episodic, where there is episodes, in which the episodes or acts succeed one another with no probable or necessary sequence, right? There's no probable or necessary. The only thing that ties together the events in such a plot is the fact that they happen to the same person. Basically, what he means is that the plot must be complete and have a unity of action. The events must be structurally connected, right? This event causes the next event. So the next event should not happen by accident. It should be either necessary, because there is a cause, there is a consequence, right? Or because it's probable, right? Probable, realistic, it's conceivable, right? There is no coincidence, right? So, for example, if we say we have a story, there is a play or a film, we have the hero, his parents are sick, he needs to, save $1 million to take his parents to the hospital, right? That's the story. So he works hard, right? He works overtime, he takes a second job, and all of a sudden he wins the lottery and he has $20 million. That's not a good plot, because winning the lottery is not necessary or probable. It's just a coincidence. It just happens, right? So it's not good. The sequence of events should be connected in a cause and effect sequence, right? They should cause one another. That's what he means, that the plot should be complete and should have unity of action. That action, as it moves from one sequence to the other, it should be unified and connected through either probability or necessity. Playwrights, he says, should not rely on coincidence. A good playwright should not rely on coincidence. And also playwrights should not use the irrational, right? The irrational shouldn't have a place. You know, when they devise the sequences, there should be a rational sequence leading from this cause to this effect, from this cause to this effect. No irrational interventions. So that's what he means by the plot should be complete and should have unity of action. He also says the plot must be of a certain magnitude, both quantitatively, meaning it should be long and complex, and qualitatively, which means that it should be serious and universal in terms of its significance. Aristotle argues that the plot should not be too brief, it shouldn't be too short. The more incidents and themes that the playwright can bring together in an organic unity, the greater the artistic value and richness of the play. The more events, the more themes you bring together, the better play it is. But those events and themes should be connected organically through the cause-effect sequence of events. The more universal and significant the meaning of the play, so the meaning of the play should not have significance only for the people in my town, or the people in my city, or the people in my country. It should have a universal significance. The more universal the significance of the play is, the better the plot is. Character is the second important thing, the second aspect of the tragedy. Character, he says, should support the plot. So the first thing is the plot. Character should support the plot, meaning that personal motivations of the characters, should be intricately connected parts of the cause-effect, right? What the character wants to do, what he wants to achieve, what choices the character takes, should be intricately, like in detail, should be connected to the cause-effect sequence of events. Characters in tragedy should have the following qualities. They should be, he says, they should be good or fine, which means that the hero, good or fine in his definition, that means they should be aristocrats, right? They should be true to life. They should be, which means that they should be realistic and believable. That means if you tell us that this character is brave, then don't show him to be cowardly, right? Show him in actions that show him to be brave. There should be consistency. The characters should have consistency. Which means that once a character's personality and motivations have been established, these should continue throughout the play. That's it. You can't change and show us the character to have different motivations and different. Also, the characters should be necessary or probable, right? Which means that you can't just invent characters like that. They should be connected logically to the cause-effect sequence of the plot. And they should be bound by the laws of probability or necessity that governs the action of the play. That's what he means by the characters should be necessary or probable. And also characters should be true to life and yet more beautiful. He means they should be idealized and in a way ennobled, right? Hamlet, for example, comes out as a noble individual. Even if he fails, we feel like we sympathize with the hero. He or she is a noble character. So these are the characteristics of plot and character. And really, in as far as like modern literary criticism is concerned, it's really plot and character are the most important aspects of Aristotle's literary criticism. But the other, the ones that are left, the other four, the third one is thought. He said the third characteristic is thought. Thought, Aristotle doesn't say much about it, and most of what he says is associated with how speeches should reveal character, which means that the speeches of a character, right? If I have a character in a play, through the speeches of this character, I can reveal the personality of that character, which means that I have to be very careful how I give speeches to this character, because it's through those speeches that I can allow you, the audience, to understand things about the personality of this character, the psychology of this character, the philosophy of this character, and so on. So this is thought. The fourth element of tragedy is diction. Diction. And he says it is the expression of the meaning in words, which are proper and appropriate to the plot, characters, and to the end of tragedy. Here Aristotle discusses the stylistic elements of tragedy. He is particularly interested in metaphors. He says the greatest thing by far is to have a command of metaphor. He says it is the mark of genius, for to make good metaphors implies an eye for resemblances. The fifth aspect of tragedy is song and spectacle. Song or melody is the musical element of the chorus. In tragedy, in ancient tragedy, when we talk about song, we're talking about the chorus. It's basically a line of 5 or 10 people that respond. They speak at once, the 5 or 10 of them, they sing, they dance, and so on. So Aristotle says that the chorus should be fully integrated into the play like an actor. Choral odes, the poems that the chorus sings, should not be just mere interludes, just entertainment in the middle between the acts. They should contribute to the unity of the plot, right? So the chorus should be part of the action and should contribute to the development of the plot and the action. The sixth and last element of tragedy, according to Aristotle, is spectacle. It's the one that's least connected to literature. The production of spectacular effects, he says, depends more on the art of the stage machinist than that of the poet. Here, basically, we're talking about what we call stage effects, right? This isn't the poet, the poet's job or business. This is what we call stage effects, right? Aristotle argues that superior poets rely on the inner structure of the play rather than on spectacle to arouse pity and fear. That means if you're a playwright, don't rely on special effects or stage effects to produce pity and fear. You should rely on the inner structure of the play and the plot to arouse pity and fear. Those who rely heavily on spectacle, he says, create a sense not of the terrible, but only of the monstrous. The final element in Aristotle's analysis of tragedy is catharsis. This is an idea that has been discussed at length throughout the centuries. Basically, it's the end of tragedy. It should produce catharsis in the audience. It's defined as purgation or cleansing. And essentially, when we watch a film, our feelings and emotions we feel pity, we feel happiness for the actors, and then we feel fear. Our emotions are all high. So with the resolution of the play, with the resolution of the problem, there should be, in the audience, there should be a psychological reaction of a catharsis. It's an act of purgation or cleansing. Catharsis is an Aristotelian term that has received a lot of attention over the world. It's simply translated as purging or cleansing. Tragedy arouses the emotions of pity and fear in order to purge away their excesses, he says, to reduce these passions to a healthy, balanced proportion. Aristotle also talks about the pleasure that is proper to tragedy, apparently meaning that the aesthetic pleasure one gets from contemplating the pity and fear that are aroused through an intricately constructed work of art. And thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Allah yakhlik.